Here you see the sponges after they come out, and that won't dry them dry. It'll take off the excess moisture. For a lot of crops, you don't need them dry. You just want the extra moisture off. If you need them dry because you are going to put a sticker on them, you might need them dry. You can put a fan over the table, and that'll get them dry within a minute or two. The table is so wonderful because you have all that product on there, and you can really pick and choose. You can sort of be pushing things around with one hand, rolling them, and then you can sort of spot them and see how it's looking, and it can really speed the process. They're sold as being able to wash 100 bushels an hour, but you would probably need 6 or 7 people to do that. I usually run them with 2 people, 1 feeding and 1 taking off, or 3 people, because 2 people can take off as fast as 1 person can put in. And then I can do 40 or 50 an hour, bushels an hour. So it's just so much faster and so much easier on the body, and you actually get nicer looking product. That's a mechanical washer. You can stick sizers on them as a separate unit, so they have little holes, and they'll size out round things like potatoes or tomatoes. You can put those on the end of a barrel washer too. And now with the food safety lesson, of course, you have to wash this equipment. It should be washed after you use it every time, and then should be sanitized. So having brushes, the right brushes to wash them, and the right soap, and then after you do that, you spray them with the sanitizer is really the process. So you wash it, you rinse it, and then you have a spray bottle of sanitizer. I'll show you some sanitizer options later. But see these brushes, how they're different colors? You got red brushes, green brushes, yellow brushes. I took this at a farm called Harmony Valley Farm, this picture. And it was the perfect solution to this issue of you don't want to be washing your vegetables with a brush that just cleaned the toilet or wash the floor. I mean, this is a serious food safety issue, and you know how busy you are, and you got a bunch of workers. How do you tell every single worker these little rules, and how do you expect them to remember them? So this farm used color-coded brushes. So green is always what you use for washing vegetables. Red is what you use for washing equipment. White's what they use for their floors. Yellow's what they use for their toilets. And there's a sign up. The brushes have writing on them telling them what they're for. They're color-coded. They're in English and Spanish. If somebody doesn't get it in this system, they're never going to get it. They probably need to be fired. You made it really obvious, really easy. That's a great food safety system. You do that, you're going to solve a lot of your food safety challenges. So the next step in the cold chain is cooling. And when we talked about respiration, I talked with you about why this is so crucial. So I think I got that across, really important. But I'm going to say it just one more time. It's the most important step that you can make for your quality. And when we talk about cooling, you want to know what the ideal storage temperature is. I gave you a chart that looks like this, and it's got this column that says cool to storage temperature. And you'll see they're not all the same. Some of them say 32, some of them, cucumbers say 50 to 55. And if you cool a cucumber down to 32, you're going to damage it. You're not going to have a quality cucumber. So knowing those storage temperatures are really important. When it says 32, I don't cool things down to 32, and I don't keep my storage cooler at 32. It's too close to freezing, and unless you have really expensive, really well-monitored equipment, which I can't imagine any of you have, you're probably going to run it at 34, 35. That's what I run my coolers at, and then if they dip a little bit, I'm not taking a chance of freezing things. So knowing, those numbers for all your crops are really important. And there's a column that says cooling method. So R means room cooling, F means forced air, H is hydrocooling, and I is ice. Those are the 4 options I'm going to talk with you about today. There's other cooling options too, like vacuum cooling, but it's very expensive equipment. I don't actually know any small farms that have a vacuum cooler. Although it is an option. See the V, it's an option there. So this is real valuable information because if it doesn't have an H or an I for hydrocooling or ice, it means you can't get it wet. So that's also giving you information about cleaning. If you shouldn't get it wet, you can't wash it with water. So those are going to be the cooling methods that you have as options. And we talked about that well. I think I got it across. So when we're talking about cooling, we're talking about the core temperature of the produce, not the room of the cooling space. So let's say you pick something that's 80 degrees. There's the cooling process and the storage process. And maybe you're doing them both in a room cooler. but you're not in the same process. If you just pick it and you put it in the cooler, it's not storing, it's cooling until it's at the storage temperature, then it's in storage. So you might not see a change in what you're doing, but you're doing a different thing. And that's actually important, like if you think about a chill-sensitive crop, because when we're talking about cooling, we're talking about the internal temperature of the produce. So if you have a chill-sensitive crop like cucumbers, where you're going to cause damage to them below 50 degrees, you can put them in a room that's 35 degrees. You're not going to cause any damage until the cucumber goes below 50 degrees. So it's not that it can't be in a colder space. It can. It's the temperature of the produce. And that's just a really important thing to really have clear. And we'll talk about adjusting that when we get to the room coolers. So you can buy a thermometer like this. It's hard to see, but there's a little thing that pokes into the fruit, and it'll take the internal temperature. And they're not that expensive, 25 or 30, and some of them come with alarms. So you could actually put it on a piece of fruit that's inside a box, and you'd know when the internal part of that box reached that temperature. So that can be a really valuable tool, especially when you're developing your systems. I'm not going to stick this in every single box that I'm cooling to know exactly when that box turned. But understanding my systems and developing, I'll do that. If I deliver to a distributor, when they receive my product, they're going to stick a thermometer in it. The stores don't, but a distributor does. And if it's supposed to be stored at 32 degrees and it comes in over 40, they might reject it. That's going to be real important to a distributor. So if you buy one of these, you can calibrate them by sticking them, you can test them by sticking them in a glass of ice water, and they should be 32 degrees to know that they're working. But spend an extra $5 and there'll be a little button on it that will reset it and recalibrate it for you, so that otherwise, if it's not 32 degrees and you have no way to recalibrate it, then you have to do this thing where if you put it in the ice water and it says it's 35, you know it's actually 32, then you have to add 3 degrees in your mind on all the thermometers. So you can do that and it works, but it's easier if you just get a thermometer that will recalibrate itself. So we'll talk about these 5 different ways of cooling products: room cooling, forced air cooling, and hydro cooling, hydro spray cooling, and ice. Now, is the food here? Well, if the food's not here, let's start talking about hydro cooling. We'll break. We'll go through that before we break. So hydro cooling, well, first I'm going to just tell you that these different methods have really different speeds. So if you just pick something that's warm and put it in a room cooler, so a room cooler is just a cold room, refrigerated unit, it's going to be really slow. The really slow way to cool something. Here on this chart it says 20 to 100 hours. So there's a lot of variables, like how tightly things are put in there, how much airflow there is. But if you have a high respiration crop and it comes in warm, that is too slow. You can't cool it in a room cooler if it's warm and expect to get a quality product. That's not going to be an option. We'll talk about other options. Forced air coolers are basically a room cooler with a fan up against the stacked product that's going to pull cold air through it. So they're moving a lot of air, and they're much faster. They're the cooling method of choice for something like a strawberry or a raspberry. I'm going to show you some pictures. Hydro cooling, water spray cooling, and ice are very fast. Okay? So knowing those different speeds is important, that we get the right cooling method for whatever your product is. But the problem with hydro cooling and water spray and ice is you can't get everything wet. So some products you can't cool them that way. So those are some of your variables. So let's talk about cooling in a tank of water, because you could be cleaning, you could be cooling, and you could be crisping. And it all looks the same. You put the product in the water, but you might be going for really different results. And there's really different rules. So the first thing to really understand about hydro cooling is it's really a food safety, an area where there's the biggest risk of contaminating your product with pathogens. Water is the perfect carrier to move those pathogens around. If you've got pathogen on one piece of produce and you put it in the water, now it's in the water and it can get on every piece of produce. And to make it worse, the produce can suck the water inside, and then the pathogen is internal, and you can't wash it off. A lot of produce is eaten raw. It's not going to be cooked to kill the pathogen, and you have a food safety illness. So there's certain rules you really have to be aware of when you are putting produce in a tank of water. So the number one rule is sanitation. The produce has to be clean before it goes in the tank of water. And when I say clean, I don't mean finished clean. Like, you can take salad mix, which might have a little bit of soil on it, and you can put that in a tank of water. But you don't put very dirty produce, like a bunched root, in a tank of water. And a lot of growers do. I mean, almost every grower of bunch roots, especially if they have clay soils where the clay can stick, they put the roots into the water to soak them so that they'll be easier to clean. But it's really not a smart thing to do for food safety. So you want to spray wash your bunched roots before you put them in a tank of water. So you might still put them in a tank of water to crisp them. When you put them in the water there, you're hydro-crisping. So we just talked about the dangers of pulling water into the produce and bringing pathogens inside. But if you want them to get crisped, and a grocery store will do this, then you want that water in there. So you have to be really sure that that water is safe to be pulling inside the produce. And you might be cooling. So if your water is cold and you put the produce in there, you're going to cool the temperature of your produce, and it's very quick. Now, in my region, most people use groundwater. They don't cool the water in the tank. They just use whatever temperature water there is. Well, we're at like 52 degrees, our groundwater. So that's actually kind of cold enough. I showed you that chart, the respiration rate chart, and you saw how the respiration rate dropped as we came down in the temperature. So 52 degrees, that's as cold as I'm going to get the produce putting it in water, but I'm out of the high respiration area. It's like I'm out of the danger zone. And so I showed you how the room cooler is slow. If I can do a combination where I bring it down to my groundwater temperature and then put ice on it, or then put it in the room cooler, it's kind of okay that the room cooler is going to finish it off and it's going to be a little slow. I've gotten out of the really high danger zone. Now, yesterday I was in Bowling Green and they told me their groundwater temperature was 59. And there was someone there from Indiana and he said his was 54. So, I mean, 59, that's really not that cold. It'd be nice if you could get it a little colder. So I'm going to keep talking about this and talk about whether that's going to get it cold enough for you, if you need to do other things to get it colder yet. You can make your water colder. You could put ice in it. You could use a refrigerated tank. I don't actually know anyone in the Midwest that does do that. We do use a lot of used milk bulk tanks from dairy farms, and they have refrigeration units on them, so you could find something like that. But now you have the issue of water temperature. And every time you, there's the 10-degree rule. So if you have produce with any dirt on it at all, like salad mix or lettuce where you've washed off the very bulk of the dirt and then you might be putting it in, there's still some dirt and you're doing a finishing clean. So there you are wanting to clean it and you're wanting to cool it. And you're wanting to crisp it. So it's kind of contradictory. You're cleaning it and you don't want the pathogens to go inside while it's dirty, but you also do want the pathogens to go inside to crisp it, and you want to cool it. So the 10-degree rule is that if your water is more than 10 degrees colder than your produce, it increases the amount of imbibing, that amount of water that's going to go inside the produce. So if you have produce that needs any level of washing, I'm going to say it one more time, if it's really dirty, you don't put it in the tank, you spray wash it first, but it still might need a little washing, then you've got to follow this 10-degree rule, where your water is within 10 degrees of your produce. And so if it's something like salad mix, you might, or lettuce, you might wash it first in a tank that is within 10 degrees of your produce, and then put it in a second tank and rinse it in cold water. And that way you'll get the cleaning in the warmer water, and then move it over to your second tank, and you'll be doing your rinsing and crisping in water that's colder, so it's also cooling. So that's the 10-degree rule. And it's more important, the most important crops are celery and potatoes and tomatoes. And on those, for food safety rules, for GAP certification, they want your water to be warmer than your produce. because they're so vulnerable to this pathogen uptake that they want it to be warmer so that it doesn't do the uptake. And then the other thing that's going to increase the amount of imbibing water going inside the produce is the depth that the produce is in the water. So as it gets, if you fill the tank really full and you're pushing the produce down in the water because there's more produce on top of it, that deeper water has more pressure, and so that pressure is going to increase the amount of water that goes in. Okay, so you can manipulate that whether or not you want water to go in and whether or not your water is safe enough to go in. But the actual tank, you know, get what you can. Something stainless steel is wonderful. There's an example of one from Frito-Lay. They closed the factory and they used it to soak their corn. It's a beautiful stainless steel tank. Some people want a really deep tank so that soil sort of settles to the bottom and is away from the produce on the top. Other people want a shallow tank so it's easier to change the water. If you're going to be manipulating your temperature, you might want a more shallow tank so that it can warm up and you can switch it out quickly. If I'm doing a 2-tank process, I actually like to have 3 tanks so that I can manipulate my temperatures as I'm moving along. I might have my wash tank warm, putting it in the cold tank. Then as my wash tank gets dirty, I'll dump it out. Then my cold tank is warmed up. It becomes my wash tank. It's warmer. And I've got my 3rd tank to be my new cold tank. And I can sort of rotate between them. That can be one way of doing that. But really, what you use should just be based on what size you want, how much water you're going to be putting in it. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. We use stock tanks that we get at our local feed mill. We actually use like a heavy plastic one. You can get stainless steel tanks from like a restaurant going out of business or grocery, but usually they're not big enough unless you're pretty small. But as I've said very clearly, you should not put those dirty roots in there and soak them. Think about, you know, again, no animal feces. Be sure your people have washed their hands before they're doing this. You have to use a waxed box if you're putting something in water, because if you use a cardboard box and it gets wet, you've really created a pathogen breeding ground. And then sanitize. If you're putting something in water, use a sanitizer. No matter what it is, use a sanitizer. Some of your options, Tsunami and Sanidate, those are both hydrogen peroxide products, and they're allowed in organic production. I like them because there's no rinse required. You can put them in your sanitation and you don't have to rinse them off. You don't have to control the pH, so you're not going to have to test your water and adjust the pH. They're allowed in organic production. They're not overly expensive. I think I spent like $200 a year to do $500,000 worth of produce. So it's not a ridiculous cost. Chlorine bleach is allowed in organic production, and it's a more standard product that's used in non-organic. I myself don't recommend it. I don't like it. Its gas is cancer causing, so I don't really want to expose my workers to it. And it's more of a hassle because it does have to be rinsed off. You can't just put it in your water and put your product in and then sell it. You have to put it in a second rinse tank, and you have to adjust the pH. If your pH isn't accurate, it's not going to work. So you have to, you know, test your water before you put it in, do whatever adjustments you need to get your pH right, test it again till you get the right pH, then put the chlorine in. So it's a little cheaper, but it's going to be a little more hassle. You know, I'm actually going to take quads off there because there's really no point in talking about them. They're not usable on the produce. They're just usable on the food contact surface. And they're not allowed in organic production. The Sanidate and Tsunami are both hydrogen peroxide products, but the Tsunami is only for produce, whereas the Sanidate is good for produce and cleaning your tables and all your food contact surfaces. It can be used for either.
You don't have to rinse it in one of those?
On Tsunami or Sanidate, no. They're hydrogen peroxide, but they're stabilized. You could just use hydrogen peroxide, but it's explosive. So if you have children, they might like that. Add a little excitement to your pack shed. And
Are you suggesting every tub of water we wash with, we should have the sanitizer?
yes, I'm saying that if you use any hydro washing, you should put the sanitizer in it. And you know, this is a sanitizer, not a disinfectant. A disinfectant kills more germs, and you know, it's like 99.9% it's going to kill the pathogens. A sanitizer isn't going to kill every pathogen, but it will it'll manage it to some degree. And once your water gets dirty, it doesn't work. The dirt makes the sanitizer ineffective. So it's not that you just put it in and you're set for the day and you can go all day long. So when you write your food safety plan, you'll have a little policy about how often you change your water. And you'll get little test strips from whoever you buy the sanitizer from. I buy it online from a company called Ecolab. If you've got a supplier in your community, you might be able to get it right here. I found it easier to just buy it online. But they'll also sell test strips where you can test if the sanitizer is still effective. And that should be done at least once an hour minimum. If your water looks dirty, then you should test it and see if it's still being effective, because that dirt is going to make the sanitizer become ineffective. If you're using chlorine, then you're also going to have to buy a test strip to test your pH. And I'm sorry, I don't know how you adjust the pH, what you put in the water. I'm going to have to learn that, find that out so people know. And then, of course, you're going to discard and change your water as needed. So I don't think I've ever kept a tank of water in use for more than an hour before I changed it out. So this is really important, and this Tsunami, these hydrogen peroxide products are really safe for those of you who are organic. I feel real comfortable using them, whereas I'm not with the chlorine, even though it is allowed in the organic standards. When we talk about food safety plans a little later, this is the kind of information you're going to write in your food safety plan. Then my wash tank water is changed, and then you're going to write how often. And water sanitizer, you're going to say what product you're using and what levels it's maintained at, and how often you test to make sure it's still being effective. And then you're going to have a log like this. And this is where you get to brush your teeth. When you put the sanitizer in, you're going to write down what you put in and what time it was and what produce you put through there. Just simple little information, but it's very important information. And it doesn't have to be computerized. You probably put it on, your hands will be a little wet from something, and get a little water or dirt on the log. It doesn't matter. But collecting this information is really important. And when we get to the end of this, we'll take lunch. I'm going to see where we are here at it. Oh, fun pictures to go before lunch. So this is an example of a hydro-cooling tank that's called the bubbler. I took a picture of this at Harmony Valley. And what he did was he took a bulk milk tank and he put a jacuzzi pump on it. And so it's just this nice little rolling action, getting those peppers, you know, kind of rolling the water and getting them nice and clean and cooling them quicker. Here you can see it's later in the process, and they're scooping the peppers out with a fish net. And then the guy standing there, he's just looking through them, looking for any that have bad spots or maybe a leaf that got in there, fishing out some more. He's putting them in a clean filled tote, and then he's going to take them over to a different space, and they're going to pack them in clamshells. But I thought that bubbler is just sort of cool. Here you can see it not in use. There's a jacuzzi pump on the bottom, and then it's just running these are PVC pipes, and they put holes in them. But if you do something like this, that's got to be cleanable, or you're going to have a food safety nightmare. So make those pipes so that you can take them apart and get in there and really clean them. Here's an example in that same bubbler where they're doing batch washing. And so you can see they've got bok choy. It's setting upside down, but before they put it in the tank, they sprayed off the butt ends where there's a little bit of dirt to get it clean, and then they put it in the tank. And then that just keeps them from floating around and getting damaged and the leaves getting bumped, and they'll kind of swish them around a little bit like this and pack them in the box. So batch washing certain crops can be really nice.